Good evening. Welcome in daily UPSC editorial audio program. Dubai, what was said in Dubai? Times of India. Article 370 judgment is a case of constitutional monism. The Hindu. Dubai, what was said in Dubai? The Times of India editorial. COP28 took a realistic approach to transitioning from fossil fuel. India's argument that only coal can't be climate villain won. What the rich world is still is not forking out enough cash. Chandrabhushan, environmentalist, attended COP28 as the gravel struck, albeit a day later than the deadline to mark the agreement at COP28 is signaled more than just the usual closure of another United Nations climate negotiations. This time, the setting was Dubai, presided over by the CEO of one of the world's biggest oil companies, and the subject was fossil fuel to the fore. For 3 decades, the international community was avoided the direct mention of fossil fuel in climate uh, agreements due to the staunch resistance from major oil and gas producers. However, COP28 shattered this status quo. The decision to transition away from fossil fuel marks a significant leap towards acknowledging and addressing the root cause of climate change. Message not mandate. The agreement aiming for the just, orderly, and equitable transition away from fossil fuels has nuanced wording to start reducing the production and consumption of fossil fuels. While it is not an explicit call for the phase down or phase out, it sends an unmistakable message to the fossil fuel industry. The era of unchecked fossil fuel consumption is drawing to a close. Fund for the Vulnerable. COP28 will also remember for operationalizing the Loss and Damage Fund on the very first day of the conference to support vulnerable developing countries in dealing with climate disaster. While the initial pledges to the fund remained about 800 million, which is far less than what is needed. The operationalization of the fund marks an important milestone in the climate justice movement. Echoing G20's India Summit decision, Dubai COP Dubai COP also enhanced the mitigation ambition by adopting the decision taken by G20 under India's presidency to triple renewable energy capacity and double energy efficiency improvement globally by 2030. India's pragmatism delivers at COP28. India's steadfast advocacy for a comprehensive approach to fossil fuel reduction also saw fruition at COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh last year. India was the first country to demand a phase down of all fossil fuels and not just coal to accelerate climate action. This year's agreement on transitioning away from fossil fuels can be seen as a direct result of India's initiative last year. Sustainability is acknowledged. Modi's call in Dubai for sustainable consumption patterns found resonance in the UAE's consensus. The inclusion of India's emphasis on transitioning to sustainable lifestyle, circular economy practices, and sustainable production pattern in the consensus text highlights India's role. Slow progress carries risk. The shortcoming of the global stock taking process were glaring evident. Component designed the critical component designed to evaluate global progress in addressing climate change acknowledge the stark reality. Current efforts are insufficient, steering us towards a worrying 2.7 degree centigrade rise in global temperatures. GST's failure to assign clear responsibility and provide actionable guidance was a significant missed opportunity. Especially concerning was its failure in highlighting the the fulfilled commitments of developing nations and its apparent leniency towards China, the world's largest emitter. Double standard of developed countries. The fact is that the developed countries have consistently not met any of their commitments or emissions reduction or financial support. They continue to invest in the new fossil fuels infrastructure and emit more than their fair share. For instance, the US presently is the largest producer of oil and gas, producing nearly a quarter of global natural gas and 15% of world's crude oil. And the Biden administration has recently approved new offshore oil and gas leases. Developed countries have also not met their collective finance obligations of providing 100 billion to developing countries. China, elephant in the room, the country's GHG emission, a quarter of the global emission, need to peak and reduce quickly to have any chance of meeting the 1.5 degree centigrade target. Yet, GST failed to point out these crucial issues. The lessons from the first GST are that global climate actions need more than just pledges. It demands accountability, transparency, and equitable responsibility sharing. Businesses business takes center stage with 70,000 confirmed attendees, each dwarfs the previous record of 30,372 set or at COP21 where the landmark Paris Agreement was forged. While some derided the large presence of business and lobbyists, the fact is that the resolution of the climate crisis will need protective need proactive participation of businesses. For years now, those in the field of sustainable development have argued for the need of a meeting between environmental concern and business interest. COP28 was for a step towards such collaboration. Why UAE consensus matters? It's a bold step towards the decision in it, and the scale at which they were showcased reflect a growing recognition of the urgency of climate action and the uh, need for substantive policy shift even in regions highly reliant on fossil fuels. Central to this shift is the emerging narrative of a just, orderly, and equitable transition away from fossil fuels, a theme that will increasingly dominate global discourse as countries internalize the imperative of shutting down fossil fuel establishments and diversifying their economies. Article 370 judgment is a case of constitutional monism. The Hindu Jay Deva, lawyer based in Srinagar, more than 4 years after the abrogation of Article 370, the Supreme Court of the actions of the Indian government. While much of the discourse around the judgment has focused on the question of statehood, it is important to remember that the special status of Jammu and Kashmir was really at the heart of the matter. To arrive at its conclusions, the court employs a historical, textual, and structural interpretation of the Constitution of India, and all three approaches are deeply informed by constitutional monism. Here are three sides where the court employ a monist reading of the Constitution and why this sets a dangerous precedent for federalism in India. Federalism and constitutional sovereignty. The monism that is reflected in the judgment imagines the Union Constitution as the sole bearer of the internal and external sovereignty. While this may be true, Article 370 laid down an elaborate framework for the distribution of power and authority between the Union and the state governments. This was affirmed by the J&K Constituent Assembly and not just as an interim measure pending total integration. The Basic Principles Committee's report, based on which the state constitutions was drafted, stated the sovereignty of the state resides in the people thereof and shall accept in a regard to matter especially entrusted to the union be exercised on their behalf by the various organs of the state. The state's legislature will have powers to make laws for the state in respect of all matters falling falling within the sphere of its residuary sovereignty. By focusing more on the particular concept of sovereignty, which requires no subordination to another body, the court ends up refusing to recognize the shared sovereignty model of Article 370. After all, sovereignty in federal constitution is not a binary concept restricted to a simple is or is not clarifications. Rather, it encompasses various dimensions and exists along a spectrum of degrees. The contingency of the presidential power. Another site where the court's monism operates is in its reading of Clause 3 of Article 370. The court rejects the argument that Article 370 had gained permanence after the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, as this is premised on the understanding that the constitutional body had uh, un- unbridled power to alter the constitutional integration of the state and the union. The court also relies on Clause 3 to hold that Clause 1 could be operated without the concurrence of the state government, since the effect of applying all the provisions of the constitution to Jammu and Kashmir through the exercise of power under Article 370 OD is the same as issuing a notification under Article 373. In a constitutional democracy, nobody or institution has unbridled power. Further, Clause 3 of the Article 370 is primarily concerned with the relationship of two powers and not just the status or the relationship of the bearing entities. The proviso to Clause 3 make it clear that the presidential power to abrogate Article 370 was contingent on the recommendations of the Constituent Assembly, as it is in the nature of the presidential powers under Clause 3 to be contingent on the Constituent Assembly. The limitation does not die with the dissolution or the assembly. The relation of powers here does not mean that the president becomes subordinate to the Constituent Assembly, but the power as a federal arrangement has been distributed across multiple axes under Article 370. The interpretation of Clause 1 that the courts offers is based on syllogistic reasoning, but one that collapses the question on the nature of powers into the question of the effect of powers, holding that the president has the un, untrammeled power to abrogate Article 370 and order a total application of the Indian Constitution to the state to the effect that the state's constitution becomes inoperative. Inoperative is an un, unbridled power that defines the logic of federalism and constitutional democracy. States' views on its future. The judgment monism imagines popular sovereignty as a monolith where, since the views of an individual state for the purpose of reorganization are not binding Parliament therefore is well placed to speak for the state. Justice Sanjay Kaul holds that views are to be taken from the entire nation via the Parliament as the issue leading to the recognition affect the nation as a whole. There are many sites within the constitution where a recommend recommendatory power is vested in a body. Merely because that power may not be binding does not mean that the power can be taken over by another body, or that power need not be exercised, because at its heart lies the question of agency. The inevitable conclusion that one arrives at is that the popular sovereignty of a state's pupil vis-a-vis the state becomes subordinate to the popular sovereignty of the entire nation vis-a-vis the union as well as the states. This is particularly worrying in the context of J&K, where where the threshold for reorganizing the state was historically much higher compared to the other states. By relying on the monist reading of the constitution in a context that defines monism, the court has not only upheld the abrogation of Article 370 but has also put its stamp of approval on the silencing and rendering inconsequential of the voice of the people of the former state of J&K. Thank you.